The water off Samar was warm, almost bathwater warm, and the hours after his ship went down, that was the cruelest thing about it. Carl Amundsen had braced for cold. He had braced for a lot of things since the order came to go over the side. He had not braced for this, for still being alive, treading oil-slick swells under a rising Philippine sun, watching gray shapes glide to the blue beneath his kicking feet. He was 20 years old. A day earlier, he had been a sailor aboard an American aircraft carrier with a galley and a bunk and a name painted on her stern. Now he was a speck in an ocean that did not know he existed, gripping a knotted rope net alongside 36 other oil-blackened men, and the nearest friendly ship had no idea any of them were there. The carrier was gone. The only question left was whether the men who had survived her would be gone too. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This is a story of how an ordinary young man from a thin-skinned ship the United States Navy itself had labeled expendable came to fight first the largest battleship ever built, and then the open ocean, and what it actually takes to stay alive when the rescue you are counting on does not even know your name. It is a story the textbooks usually tell from a bridge, in the language of admirals and battle lines. But the truth of it lived lower down, in the water in the dark, among cooks and mess attendants and teenage seamen, who were never supposed to be in a sea fight at all. To understand how they ended up there, we have to back up about a day, to a decision made hundreds of miles away by men who would never see the consequences with their own eyes. By the third week of October, 1944, the United States had returned to the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur had waded ashore at Leyte, fulfilling a promise he had made 2.5 years earlier, and behind him an enormous invasion fleet crowded the Gulf. Transports heavy with troops, supply ships, the soft and vital machinery of an amphibious landing. That fleet was a prize. The Imperial Japanese Navy understood that if it could smash the ships in Leyte Gulf, it could strand MacArthur's army on the beach and turn the whole invasion into a catastrophe. So Japan committed nearly everything it had left to a complex, desperate plan built around deception. The plan worked better than its authors could have dreamed. A decoy force of Japanese aircraft carriers, nearly empty of planes, was sent north as bait. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the powerful Third Fleet of fast carriers and battleships, took the bait. Believing he had found the enemy's main strength, Halsey steamed north with everything, chasing the decoys. In doing so, he left the San Bernardino Strait, the back door to Leyte Gulf, completely unguarded. There was a misunderstanding in the orders, a confusion over a unit that everyone assumed had been left behind to watch the strait, and that no one had actually left behind. The door stood open, and in the darkness of the early morning, the most powerful surface force the Japanese could still assemble slipped through it. That force belonged to Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, and it was a monster. For battleships, including the Yamato, 72,000 tons fully loaded, carrying 18-inch guns that could hurl a shell weighing more than a small car some 26 miles. Around her steamed her sisters and a screen of heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers, more than 20 warships in all, their guns ranging from 8 inches up to the largest ever mounted on a ship. Kurita's force had been hammered from the air the day before and had lost one of its own giants, but it remained overwhelmingly strong, and it was now bearing down undetected on the only thing standing between it and the invasion fleet, a small, slow, lightly armed group of escort carriers whose entire reason for being was to support the men on the beach, not to fight a battle line. There were 3 of these escort carrier groups operating off Samar, and by radio call sign, they were known as Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3. It was Taffy 3, under Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, a man his sailors knew as Ziggy, that lay directly in Kurita's path. Taffy 3 was 6 escort carriers, screened by 3 destroyers and 4 of the smaller destroyer escorts. That was all. The escort carriers were the heart of it, and to understand the men in the water, you have to understand what those ships actually were. An escort carrier, designated CV in the Navy's shorthand, was not a fleet carrier. It was a compromise born of necessity, a flat flight deck laid over what was essentially a merchant hull, mass-produced at astonishing speed in the shipyards of Henry Kaiser to meet the war's bottomless demand for aircraft at sea. The Gambier Bay was one of these, a Casablanca-class ship built in Vancouver, Washington, and commissioned at Astoria, Oregon, in December of 1943. She displaced only around 8,000 tons standard, ran a little over 500 feet long, and was driven not by powerful turbines but by reciprocating steam engines that pushed her, on a good day, to perhaps 19 knots. Her armament for self-defense against ships amounted to a single 5-inch gun mounted at the stern, plus a fringe of light anti-aircraft weapons meant for swatting at planes. She carried no armor belt worth the name. Her sailors had a grim joke about what those 3 letters, CV, really stood for: combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. That word, expendable, was not just gallows humor. It described a real strategic judgment. These ships were built to ferry planes, to hunt submarines, to fly close air support over invasion beaches. They were never intended to trade gunfire with cruisers, let alone battleships. The men who crewed them reflected that purpose. They were not, for the most part, hardened surface warriors trained for a slugging match at sea. They were aviators and plane handlers, radiomen and yeomen, cooks and bakers and mess attendants, young men, many of them just out of small towns and high schools, who had signed up to do a job that did not involve being shot at by 18-inch guns. Carl Amundsen was one of them, a kid from Chandler, Minnesota, who had crossed an ocean to end up on the flight deck of the Gamber Bay. None of them, when they turned in the night before, had any reason to expect that dawn would bring the Imperial Japanese Navy out of the haze with its main battery already swinging toward them. The first warning came as something almost impossible to believe. Lookouts and radar operators began reporting ships on the horizon to the northwest, and then the unmistakable pagoda-style mass of Japanese battleships. For a few seconds, men assumed it had to be part of Halsey's fleet. It was not. At a little after 6 minutes past 8 in the morning, the answer arrived in the form of towering, colored geysers of water rising around the escort carriers, the dye-marked splashes of heavy shells finding the range. Admiral Sprague did the only things he could do. He turned his carriers away, ran them for the cover of a passing rain squall, ordered every plane that could fly to get airborne, and sent his destroyers and destroyer escorts charging directly at the Japanese line in a series of near-suicidal torpedo attacks meant to buy the carriers time. It is one of those torpedo runs, the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, hurling herself at battleships and cruisers far beyond her weight, that has become legendary in its own right. But while those small ships fought and died to the north, the Gamber Bay found herself in the worst possible position within the formation. On the side nearest the enemy, the closest large target, the one the Japanese gunners could most easily reach. For a desperate stretch she ran and dodged, making smoke, chasing the squalls, while shell splashes walked closer and closer. And then her luck ran out. A heavy shell. Most American survivors believe it came from the cruiser Chikuma's 8-inch guns, though Japanese accounts argue it may have been a battleship round from Yamato or Kongo herself. Found her hull. Here lay one of the bitter ironies of her thin construction. Many of the armor-piercing shells fired at her were built to punch through the thick steel of a real warship before detonating, and the Gamber Bay simply did not have steel thick enough to set those fuses off. Some shells passed clean through her, in one side and out the other, leaving neat holes without exploding. But it did not matter. One round tore into an engine room and flooded it, and her speed, never more than a fast walk to begin with, dropped by nearly half. A ship that could not keep up could not hide in the smoke and the rain. She fell behind a formation, and the Japanese cruisers, sensing a kill, closed the range toward point blank, firing as they came. What followed was not a battle so much as a methodical destruction. Shell after shell struck home. Fires took hold and spread through the riddled hull. The single 5-inch gun aft kept firing back at targets it could scarcely hope to hurt, a gesture of pure defiance more than any real defense. Below decks and on the hangar deck, men fought flooding in flames with whatever they had. Up on the bridge, Captain Walter Vuig watched his command being dismantled around him and understood where it was heading. By a few minutes before 9 o'clock, the Gamber Bay was dead in the water, without power, without speed, burning, while 3 enemy cruisers stood off at murderously close range and pounded her at will. If you find the story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The end came quickly after that, with the ship listing and the fires raging. The order passed to abandon her. Men who had spent the last hour at battle stations now faced a different kind of terror. The sea itself, 30 feet down past a tilting, burning deck, they threw over what they could. The few life rafts, the floater nets, anything that would hold a man up. They pulled on K-Poc life jackets and went over the side, some climbing down, some simply jumping, into water that was already slick with the ship's own fuel oil. Out in that water, men who had gotten clear early shouted warnings back at the ship, urging the swimmers to get away as fast as they could, because a torpedo-armed Avenger was still sitting on one of the carrier's elevators, and when the flames reached it, it went up with a violence that detonated stored bombs and sent a shudder through everything nearby. Minutes later, at 7 minutes past 9 in the morning, the Gambier Bay rolled over onto her port side. For a moment, her keel lay bare to the sky, and the men nearest her could see the wounds in her bottom. The shell holes punched clean through the place where a screw should have been. She had been so evenly perforated, so thoroughly riddled, that when she did not roll or plunge bow first, she simply settled, straight down and slipped under. The whole thing, from that first shell at 6 minutes past 8 to the moment the sea closed over her at 11 minutes past 9, had taken 1 hour and 1 minute. The career, the only American aircraft carrier ever sunk by enemy gunfire, had lasted 3 days short of 10 months. Of the roughly 900 men who had been aboard her that morning, about 130 would not survive, burned by the fires, crushed by machinery torn loose in the chaos, killed outright by the shells, or simply lost in confusion of those final minutes. The rest, somewhere around 700 men, were now in the water. Many were wounded. Almost all were coated in thick black fuel oil that stung their eyes and burned in their throats when they swallowed it, that made them retch and worsened everything it touched. They clung to the rafts and the nets and to one another, and they watched their ship disappear, and then they looked around at an empty ocean. This was the moment the battle ended for them, and a different ordeal began. Up to now, however terrible, events had at least made sense in a language they knew. General quarters, damage control, the order to abandon ship. There were officers, there were procedures, there was the assumption underlying all of it that the United States Navy knew where they were and would come for them. That assumption was about to be quietly, catastrophically wrong. The fight off Samar was still raging across miles of sea. The surviving ships were running for their lives or fighting for them. The rescue that the men in the water took for granted would not even be organized for hours, would search in the wrong places, and would nearly miss them entirely. And the sea around them was not empty after all. Down in the warm blue water, drawn by the noise and the blood, and the slow churn of hundreds of kicking legs, the first gray shapes had already begun to gather. Carl Amundsen found a floater net and took hold of it alongside 36 other men. He was alive. His ship was 4 miles down and falling, and the longest hours of his life were just beginning. Here's part 2, the collision with reality, running close to 4,000 words. This is the ordeal in the water. The oil, the sun, the sharks, the long night, the failed search, and the flares that finally turned it. Everything stays anchored to the documented record of the Gambier Bay survivors and the Task Group 78.12 rescue. For the men who made it off the Gambier Bay, the first enemy was not the sharks, and it was not even the thirst that would come later. It was the oil. Their own ship had bled into the sea as she died. Hundreds of tons of thick black fuel oil spreading across the swells in a slick that coated everything it touched. A man came up out of dive into it and surfaced into a film of it, and it went into his eyes and his nose and his mouth. It stunned the eyes so badly that men instinctively rubbed at them, which only ground the oil in deeper and made the burning worse. It coated their throats, those who swallowed any of it, and in the chaos of going over the side, many did, soon grew nauseated and began to vomit, losing precious fluid they did not yet understand they would need to hoard. The oil turned them all the same color, a uniform glistening black from scalp to waist, so that within minutes the 700 or so survivors of an American aircraft carrier no longer looked like sailors at all. They looked like something the sea had made, bobbing heads in a fouled ocean, indistinguishable one from another except by the sound of familiar voice. They organized themselves the only way they could, which was around whatever floated. The Gambier Bay had carried a small number of life rafts and a larger number of floater nets, and these became the islands of the new world the men found themselves in. A floater net was a simple, brutal piece of equipment, a square mesh of heavy rope with cork or kapok floats woven through at intervals, designed to be flung overside and to keep a cluster of men at the surface by giving them something to hook their arms and legs through. It did not lift a man out of the water. It only kept him from sinking, and only if he held on. Carl Amundsen got his hands into one of these nets along with 36 other men, 37 in all, clinging to a single rope grid in the middle of the Philippine Sea. The most badly wounded among the survivors, the ones whose blood would draw exactly the wrong kind of attention, were lifted where possible into the few actual rafts, partly to keep them alive and partly to keep their open wounds up out of water. The water itself was deceptively kind at first, and that kindness was a trap. It was warm, somewhere around 80 degrees, warm enough that no one was to die of cold during the day. After the terror of the battle, after the fires and the shells and the long drop over the side, there was even a strange first flush of relief among some of the men. They were alive. The ship was gone, but they had gotten clear. And the universal assumption, the thing nearly every one of them believed in those first hours, was that this would not last long. The American fleet was enormous. The Gulf was full of friendly ships. Surely someone had seen the Gamber Bay go down. Surely the word was already out. Surely rescue was a few hours away at most. We figured we'd get picked up real quick, Amundsen would say later. That belief was the thing that kept many of them going through the first afternoon. It was also, for far too many of them, wrong. Because the truth was that no one was coming, not yet, and not for where the men expected. The battle off Samar was still raging across miles of ocean. Admiral Sprague's surviving ships were either running for their lives or fighting for them, in no position to stop and pluck men from the water. To the north, the men in the swells could still hear it. The deep concussion of heavy guns rolling across the sea, the distant crumb of explosions, the drone of aircraft engines. They had no way of knowing how it was going. They did not know whether the United States Navy was winning or losing that morning, whether the great battleships would finish their work and then turn south to the helpless invasion fleet, whether the whole campaign was collapsing while they floated there blind. And then, gradually, through the late morning and into the afternoon, the guns to the north grew fainter and then stopped. The silence that followed was its own kind of terror. It might mean rescue. It might mean the enemy had won and gone. The men in the water simply did not know, and the not knowing pressed down on them as heavily as the sun. That sun was the second enemy, and it was patient, with the oil washing slowly off and the novelty of survival wearing thin. The men began to feel the tropical glare on the backs of their necks, on their faces, on every patch of exposed skin. There was no shade anywhere in that flat blue expanse except the shadow of man's own head cast on the water and the shadow of the man next to him. By the second day, sunburn had become a torment for many of them, blistering skin already raw from salt and oil. And with the heat came the thirst. The human body in tropical heat loses water steadily, hour after hour, through sweat and breath, and these men had nothing to replace it with. They were surrounded by an entire ocean of water, and not one drop of it was safe to drink. Seawater would only accelerate the dehydration and push a man toward kidney failure and madness. Every veteran of such ordeals knew the rule, and the officers in the water repeated it. Do not drink the sea. But thirst is one of the oldest and most insistent of human drives, and as the hours stretched on, some men could not hold the line. They drank, and the salt began its work on their minds. It was somewhere in this first long stretch, the afternoon, the men strung out across the swells in their clusters, the oil thinning, the thirst growing, that the gray shapes arrived in earnest. The Philippine Sea is shark water, the noise and concussion of the sinking, the churn of hundreds of legs, and above all the blood from the wounded had been broadcasting an invitation for hours, and the sharks answered it. The men first saw them as movement below, long pale shapes turning lazily in the blue beneath their feet, rising, circling, falling away, rising again. A shark, testing a group of men, does not always strike at once. It approaches, it withdraws, it comes back, learning, judging which of these splashing things is weak and which can still fight. When the men kicked and beat the water and shouted, the sharks would often slide away. When a man grew too exhausted to do anything but hang limp on the net, or when one drifted alone away from the others, the sharks closed in. On Amundsen's net, The defense came down to one man and a knife. There was a cook among the 37, and the cook had managed to keep a knife with him through the abandoned ship and the swim. Every time he saw a shark drifting in toward the rope grid, he would drive the knife down into the water at it, stabbing at the gray shape, and the men on the net hung on and watched him do it. Amundsen never forgot the look on the cook's face during those moments. Every time he saw a shark getting close to the net, he remembered. The man would jab the knife into the water, and at the same time, Amundsen swore to it for the rest of his life. The cook turned white as bone, in the middle of a sunburnt, oil-blackened ocean, every single time a shark came near. It was the face of a man doing the only thing he could do against something far larger and far older than he was, knowing the knife was almost nothing, and doing it anyway, again and again, because the alternative was to do nothing and let the net be picked apart one man at a time. And men were being picked apart. Not on every net and not all at once, but across that scattered field of survivors the sharks took their toll for the day and into the night. The accounts of Samar are consistent and grim on this point. Sharks killed many of the drifting crewmen, and they took the isolated ones first. This was the iron logic that the survivors had to learn fast and enforce on one another. Stay together. Stay with the net, with the raft, with the cluster. A man who let go, who drifted off because he was delirious or despairing or simply too tired to hold on, was a man the current would separate from the group, and alone head in open water, was exactly what the sharks were looking for. The officers and the steadier men spent themselves keeping the groups intact, pulling drifters back, talking to the ones who were slipping away, organizing the clinging mass of men into something that could still, however feebly, defend itself. It was leadership of the most basic and most desperate kind, exercised not from a bridge but neck-deep in the sea, and it saved lives that nothing else could have saved. Then the sun went down, and the men learned that the warm sea had been hiding a second cruel trick. The same water that had been almost comfortable under the noon glare turned cold once the sun was gone. It was not cold enough to kill quickly, the way the North Atlantic kills, but it was cold enough to sap a man to the long hours of darkness, to set teeth chattering and muscles cramping, to drain the strength a man needed to keep his grip on the rope. And the dark brought its own horrors. A man could no longer see the sharks coming. He could only feel the brush of something passing his legs, the sudden tug of the water, and somewhere out in the blackness, a scream cut off short, and then silence, and then the unbearable wondering about who it had been. There was no moon-bright comfort out there, no horizon to fix on, just hundreds of exhausted, frightened, oil-soaked men holding on in the dark, listening to the sea and to each other, counting the hours until the dawn that they were sure, they had to be sure, would bring the ships. It was during these hours, the first night and the day that followed, that the dehydration and exposure began to claim men who had survived everything else. Saltwater poisoning, exhaustion, the slow grinding effect of sun and thirst and shock all worked together, and the human mind under that kind of strain begins to come apart. Men hallucinated. Some became convinced they could see ships that were not there or land that was not there, and struck out swimming for it, away from the group, and were not seen again. Some, in the grip of the salt madness, insisted they would just swim down to the ship's scuttlebutt for a drink of fresh water, or dive to a galley that lay for miles beneath them, and let go of the net to do it. And some simply gave up. The will to keep fighting is not infinite. And after enough hours of pain and fear and thirst, a certain number of men reached the end of theirs. They released their grip. They slipped beneath the surface without a struggle, choosing, in whatever was left of their reasoning, the quiet of drowning over more the ordeal. The men around them, themselves barely holding on, could do nothing but watch them go. There was a particular and terrible duty that fell to the living in those clusters. When a man died of his wounds, of exhaustion, of the things the water did, his body could not be allowed to remain among the survivors. A corpse tied to the net or floating in the group was a beacon for the sharks and a horror for the living to look upon, hour after hour, a preview of their own possible fate. So the men did what men in that situation have always had to do. They freed the dead from the rafts and the nets, said whatever a half-conscious, salt-cracked voice could manage, and pushed them away, out into the current, to drift off alone. It was an act of mercy and self-preservation at once, and it was one of the heaviest things any of them ever had to do, and many of them did it more than once across those 2 days. Among the men somewhere in that water was an officer named Vereen Bell, a Georgian in his early 30s who, before the war, had been something the rest of the crew might have found hard to imagine out there in the oil and the dark, a published novelist, the author of a book called Swamp Water that had been made into a Hollywood film. He had set aside that life to put on a uniform and serve aboard the Gamber Bay, and he had come through the sinking alive, but he did not come through what followed. Vereen Bell is recorded as having died on the 26th of October, 1944, the day after his ship went down, one of the men the sea took during the long wait, a writer whose own last chapter went unwritten somewhere in the Philippine Sea. He stands in for the others whose names are less remembered, the cooks and the firemen and the teenage seamen who survived the unsurvivable battle only to be lost in the water in the hours when the Navy did not yet know where to look, because that, it turned out, was the cruelest fact of the whole ordeal, and the men in the water did not even know it. Help had, in fact, been set in motion, but late and far away and pointed at the wrong place. On the afternoon of the battle, around 3 o'clock, a dispatch had been intercepted from a patrolling aircraft, reporting groups of men hanging onto rafts and debris in the waters off Samar with no ships anywhere near them. It reached the staff of the amphibious commander, Admiral Daniel Barbie, and one of his officers, Captain Charles Adair, proposed that they assemble a rescue group from the small craft of the invasion fleet, the patrol craft and the landing craft infantry, the LCIs, whose bow ramps made them well suited to hauling men out of the sea. They had to send dispatch after dispatch up the chain to get approval, sending an officer by boat across the anchorage to the fleet flagship to push for action before the rescue plan was finally cleared. By late afternoon, a little task group had formed, given the designation Task Group 78.12, built around the patrol craft PC 623 as flagship, with another patrol craft and 5 LCIs, and commanded by a Naval Reserve officer, Lieutenant Commander James Baxter. Medical personnel and supplies were rushed aboard, and then they got underway into the gathering dark toward a rescue area that lay some 125 miles distant. 125 miles, in small craft that could make only 9 or 10 knots, is the better part of a day. The rescue ships could not simply appear. They had to crawl across the sea through the night and into the next morning to even reach the right stretch of ocean. And when they got there on the 26th, they faced a problem that no amount of courage could solve. The men were not where they were supposed to be. All through the daylight hours of the 25th and into the 26th, the survivors had been drifting. Wind and current had taken hold of the scattered clusters of nets and rafts and carried them steadily away from the position where the ships had gone down, the only position the rescuers had to search. Baxter's little fleet fanned out into a line, spaced 1,000 and then 2,000 yards apart for the widest possible coverage, and combed the battle area methodically, and found almost nothing but oil slicks and floating debris, a 50 caliber ammunition box, an aircraft belly tank, the scattered flotsam of sunken ships. They passed through heavy oil. They saw planes overhead. But the men they were looking for had been carried out of the search box by the sea itself. And the men, for their part, could see the help they could not summon. This was perhaps the deepest torment of the second day. Aircraft passed overhead. Friendly aircraft, search planes, the very eyes that were supposed to find them. And the men in the water waved and shouted and splashed and were not seen. A scattering of oil-blackened heads in a vast blue ocean is very nearly invisible from the air, and the swells hid them, and the planes droned on and away. Each time it happened, hope rose and then crashed. The men had a few signaling tools, various pistols, which fired colored signal flares, and the instinct of experienced sailors told them these were precious beyond measure. So they hoarded them. They did not waste their flares on the daylight, when a flare would be a faint thing against the bright sky, and the searchers might be anywhere. They held them, through the burning afternoon, through the deaths, through the thirst, waiting for the dark when a flare would burn like a small bright star against the black, and a searcher might actually see it. It took extraordinary discipline to hold a flare in your hand for hours while you watched the ship smoke on the horizon, and could not be sure it would ever come close enough. But that discipline was about to be the thing that saved more than 1,000 lives. For Amundsen, drifting on his net through that second day, the fear had taken on a particular and dreadful shape. The same current that had carried the survivors out of the rescuer's search box was carrying them somewhere, and it was carrying them toward land. But the land it was carrying them toward was held by the Japanese. To be swept ashore on that coast meant capture at best, and the men knew it. So the ocean had a range of perfect cruelty. The open sea meant sharks and thirst and the chance, growing fainter by the hour, of an American ship. The shore meant an enemy beach. There was no good direction to drift. If we'd been out there much longer, Amundsen said afterward, we would have been on a Japanese-infested island. The current was taking us toward one. 2 days in, blistered and parched and surrounded by sharks. The survivors of the Gambier Bay were caught between the predators of the sea and the soldiers of the shore, and the margin between them was shrinking with every hour. The turn, when it finally came in the dark of the second night. Out across the black water, the men of Task Group 78.12, who had searched all the wrong places through 2 daylights and found only wreckage, caught sight of something they'd been straining for. The small, bright, unmistakable arc of signal flares rising off the surface of the sea. Red, white, and green, fired by men who had hoarded them for exactly this moment. The various flares climbed into the night sky, bearing roughly west of the searchers, and at last the rescue ships had a direction. They turned toward the lights. Shortly after, the lookouts began calling out the things the flares had promised. Rafts and then men scattered across the swells, lifting their oil-streaked faces toward the dark shapes sliding in out of the night. And here the cruelty of the situation arranged one final twist of the knife, because the men in the water could not at first tell what was coming for them. Out of the blackness loomed the silhouettes of ships, and to exhausted, half-delirious survivors who knew they had been drifting toward an enemy coast. Those shapes were as likely to be Japanese as American. Amundsen and the men on his net watched the vessels approach with a hope so badly tangled with dread that it was almost worse than no hope at all. We actually thought it was a Japanese destroyer that was picking us up, he remembered. After everything, the battle, the sinking, the oil, the sun, the sharks, the long night, the friends pushed out into current. The friends who simply let go. The men faced one last unbearable uncertainty as the hulls drew near, whether the end of the ordeal would be rescue or capture, salvation, or the enemy's deck. Then the lines came down. Cargo nets and ropes were flung over the sides of patrol craft and the landing craft, and American voices called out across the water, and the men understood at last that the shapes in the dark were their own. The work of pulling them out began in the small hours of the 27th of October, and it was slow and difficult, because the survivors were in no condition to save themselves. 2 days in the water had left them so weak that many could not climb a cargo net even with rope in their hands. The crews of the rescue ships had to reach down and physically haul them up over the rails like dead weight, one ruined man at a time. They came up oil-black and salt-cracked, their skin sloughing from sunburn and immersion, their wounds gone septic in the warm sea. Some unconscious, some raving, some simply unable to let go of the net they had clung to for 40 hours until another man's hands pried their fingers loose. Each one of them, as he came over the rail and onto a steel deck that did not move beneath the water, had crossed back over a line that hundreds of his shipmates had not. The Gambier Bay was 4 miles down. The battle was decided, and for the men whose flares had brought the ships out of the night, the longest hours of their lives were at last beginning to end. Here's part 3, the aftermath and legacy, at about 1,000 words, closing the loop back to the opening and carrying the final CTA. The rescue ran through the rest of that night, and on into the day. Lieutenant Commander Baxter's little task group worked the swells methodically, easing alongside raft after raft, hauling men up a few at a time. They were pulling survivors not only from the Gambier Bay, but from the other ships that had died off Samar, the destroyers Hull and Johnston, and the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts. In one of those quiet coincidences that history leaves lying around, the commanding officer of the Roberts, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, was among the men brought aboard around noon on the 27th, pulled from the same water by the same ships as Carl Amundsen. By the time Admiral Barbie ordered the search broken off and the rescue craft turned back toward Leyte Gulf, they had recovered more than 1,100 men in all, somewhere around 1,150 survivors of 4 sunken ships, carried back to the hospital ship Comfort and to the transports waiting in San Pedro Bay. Of the Gambier Bay's own company, Captain Buick later approved a report estimating that around 700 of his men had lived through the battle and the sea. The rest, roughly 1 in 7 of the men who had sailed her, were gone. For the survivors, the first hunger after rescue was a literal one. Pulled aboard half-starved and parched, the men of the Gambier Bay fell on whatever food the rescue crews could produce. Amundsen remembered it plainly They ate everything those ships had. They ran the vessels clean out of coffee before they ever reached Leyte. From the Gulf, the survivors were moved on to New Guinea and eventually to Brisbane, Australia, and then home aboard a former luxury liner that delivered them to San Francisco at the start of December 1944, where they were granted 30 days of survivors' leave before the Navy found new ships and new duties for them. Amundsen went back to southwest Minnesota for that month, and then returned to the war. The hardest thing to grasp about their ordeal is that it was not, in the cold arithmetic of strategy, in vain. While the men of Taffy 3 were dying in the water, their sacrifice, and the sacrifice of the ships that charged the Japanese line, had accomplished something that should have been impossible. Vice Admiral Kurita, with the most powerful surface force still afloat, with the invasion fleet at Leyte all but defenseless before him, broke off the engagement and turned away north. His reasons have been argued about ever since. The ferocity of those suicidal destroyer attacks, the relentless air strikes from the escort carriers, his own losses, and a fatal confusion in which he came to believe he was fighting fleet carriers and heavy cruisers rather than thin-skinned escort ships and a handful of small boys. The deception worked precisely because men like the crew of the Gambier Bay had fought so far beyond what their ships were ever built to do that the enemy could not believe what he was actually looking at. Kurita withdrew. The transports in Leyte Gulf, with all the troops and supplies that the return to the Philippines depended on, survived untouched. The little ships the Navy had called combustible, vulnerable, and expendable had turned back a battle line, and the men who paid for it were the ones in the oil and the dark. The recognition came, as it so often does, written in the language of citations. Taffy 3 received the Presidential Unit Citation for extraordinary heroism. The Gambier Bay carried 4 battle stars for her short career, but the deeper legacy lived in the men and in the water itself, which kept its secret for a long time. The wreck of the only American aircraft carrier ever sunk by enemy gunfire lay miles down in the Philippine Sea, unseen and unreachable, while the survivors grew old and the reunions thinned. The battle off Samar passed into Navy memory as something close to sacred, an action so lopsided and so improbably won that it is still studied as one of the finest hours of service ever had. And one by one, the men who had lived it carried it home and quietly grew old with it. Carl Amundsen went back to Minnesota and lived a long life there, one of the dwindling number who could say they had floated for 2 days in shark water off Samar and come home. When such men were asked about it, most of them said some version of the same thing the survivors of these battles always say. They had done their job. They had held on. The luck that pulled them up a cargo net in the dark had passed over better men than themselves, and they knew it, and they did not pretend otherwise. Which brings us back to where we began, to a 20-year-old gripping a rope net in the warm and terrible sea, watching the gray shapes turn beneath his feet, certain of nothing except that his ship was gone and that no one knew he was there. The question this story set out to answer was what it actually takes to survive when the rescue you're counting on does not even know your name. The answer, it turns out, was not a single act of heroism. It was a cook with a knife who turned white and stabbed at the water anyway. It was a discipline to hoard a flare for hours against a darkness that might never bring a ship. It was men pulling drifters back and pushing the dead away and holding on to a rope and each other through one night and another. The Navy considered ships like the Gambier Bay expendable. The men aboard her proved that the word never really applied to people, only to steal. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.